What happens when an innocent woman is wrongfully accused by a racist cop? Can a single moment in court turn the tide against years of abuse? Alexis Green's fight for justice exposes a system built on bias, but is it enough to spark real change? Find out how this powerful story unfolds on Voices of the Underdog. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more gripping stories. The courtroom was eerily silent, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The high ceilings of the courthouse echoed faintly with the shuffle of shoes and the rustling of papers. It was a crisp morning in Dallas, Texas, and the tension in the room seemed palpable, a brewing storm just waiting to explode. In the witness box sat Officer Ryan Clark, his posture rigid, his arms crossed defensively across his chest. The tall, muscular cop looked every bit the part of a man accustomed to power. His dark hair was slicked back, and his uniform was perfectly pressed, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding in the courtroom. At the defendant's table, Alexis Green sat calmly, her gaze unwavering. She was an image of grace, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the volatile emotions boiling beneath the surface. Alexis was a black woman, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. The sheen of the silk fabric matched the coolness of her expression. Her hair was pulled back neatly into a bun, and her face was neutral, neither angry nor afraid, but resolute. Despite the accusations against her, there was a quiet confidence in the way she held herself. She was a U.S. Secret Service agent, and her reputation was built on honor and integrity. But today, her very presence in the courtroom was being questioned by Officer Ryan Clark, the man who had accused her of trespassing. The very man who had arrested her the night before, after an altercation outside the lavish Verdant Heights Hotel, one of the city's most exclusive establishments. The irony of the situation was not lost on Alexis. The officer who was supposed to uphold the law was now the one seeking to tarnish her reputation. The incident that led to Alexis's arrest had been fueled by nothing more than the officer's arrogance and prejudice. Alexis had been standing near her vehicle in front of the hotel when Clark had approached her, accusing her of trespassing on private property. She had explained calmly that she had simply been waiting for her ride to arrive. But Clark, with his typical disdain for anyone he deemed out of place, had insisted she was loitering. His manner was condescending, dismissive of her explanation. He had demanded her identification, a request she complied with, though something about his demeanor unsettled her. He had a deep-rooted contempt for people like her, a look in his eyes that made her skin crawl. It was this underlying hostility that had caused the situation to escalate. When Alexis had asked to see his badge number, Clark had become visibly agitated, his tone growing more belligerent by the second. Before she knew it, he had slammed her wrists together, forcefully cuffing her with little regard for protocol. Alexis had tried to remain calm to diffuse the situation, but she had been taken to the station, charged with trespassing. It was an abuse of power, and she would not let it go unchallenged. Now, in the courtroom, Officer Clark sat on the witness stand, his arrogant smirk evident, even as the judge's gavel pounded and the case began. He looked out over the room, his eyes scanning over the gallery, occasionally making brief eye contact with the prosecutor, as if to reaffirm his conviction that he was right. But deep down, even he could sense the unease in the air. Something about this trial felt different. The judge, Judge Leonid Palmer, an older man with graying hair and a commanding presence, banged his gavel again, calling for order. His voice was firm, clear, and demanded attention. Judge Palmer, order in the court. We are here today to hear the case of the people versus Alexis Green. Officer Clark, please continue with your testimony. Officer Clark straightened in his seat, his smug expression never faltering. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice dripping with condescension. "Officer Clark, thank you, Your Honor. As I mentioned earlier, I was on patrol near the Verdant Heights Hotel when I observed the defendant, Miss Green, standing in front of the entrance, acting suspiciously. I approached her to question her, and she immediately became defensive, refusing to provide her identification. She was argumentative, making false claims about not being on the property, despite the fact that she clearly was. I had no choice but to arrest her for trespassing." Alexis's eyes narrowed as she listened to Clark's words. His version of events was skewed, an outright distortion of the truth. She could almost feel her blood boiling as his lies continued, but she refused to let him see that he had gotten under her skin. Instead, she sat upright, her expression as controlled as ever. Prosecutor Lisa Johnson stood up and addressed the court, her voice steady and authoritative. She was a seasoned lawyer, well-versed in cases of police misconduct, and today, she was prepared to dismantle Clark's testimony piece by piece. "Prosecutor Johnson, Officer Clark, you mentioned that Miss Green was defensive. What exactly do you mean by that? Was she refusing to answer your questions, or was she simply asking to verify your identity as any law-abiding citizen would in such a situation?" Clark paused for a moment, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. He had not been prepared for the prosecutor's directness, but he was determined to stick to his narrative. "Officer Clark, I'm not sure what she was thinking, but she was acting erratically. And when I asked for her ID, she hesitated and gave me a hard time." Prosecutor Johnson, "Officer, did Miss Green ever physically resist you? Was there any indication that she was a danger to you or anyone else?" Clark's face reddened slightly, the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He hesitated, knowing that the evidence did not support his claims. "Officer Clark, no, she didn't physically resist, but the way she acted, her attitude, it was clear she wasn't cooperating." Alexis's jaw clenched as Clark continued to twist the truth. It was becoming evident to everyone in the courtroom that he was trying to justify his actions, despite the lack of any real evidence or reason for the arrest. The tension in the room was rising. Whispers began to ripple through the gallery. The spectators could feel the imbalance of power in the room, the officer's arrogance clashing with Alexis's poised, calm demeanor. And though Alexis was a seasoned professional, part of her felt the weight of being unjustly accused, the sting of racial bias that had led to this entire situation. The judge, sensing the escalating emotions in the room, banged his gavel once more. "Judge Palmer, enough, Officer Clark. You will speak only when prompted. Miss Green, I'll allow you to address the court." For a moment there was silence. Alexis stood slowly, her every movement deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath as she walked toward the stand, the eyes of everyone locked on her. "Alexis Green, Your Honor, I did not resist. I did not refuse to identify myself. I waited, as any responsible citizen would, for the right moment to present my ID. When I felt the situation becoming tense, I wanted to ensure I was speaking to someone who was acting within the law, as I am entitled to do." Officer Clark escalated the situation unnecessarily. Her voice was firm, clear, and calm. It rang through the courtroom like a bell, carrying the weight of her conviction. "Alexis Green, but what's more troubling, Your Honor, is the fact that Officer Clark assumed I was guilty before even speaking to me. He profiled me simply based on my appearance without any cause. This is not an isolated incident. This is systemic." There was a moment of stunned silence in the courtroom as her words hung in the air. Alexis had turned the tables. Clark, who had been mocking her moments before, now looked rattled. His earlier smirk had completely faded, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. The judge glanced over at the prosecutor and then back at Officer Clark, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. The temperature in the room had shifted. The audience could sense that things were about to take a very different turn. And then, just as Alexis was about to continue, something unexpected happened. Officer Clark scoffed loudly, his voice dripping with disdain. "Officer Clark, right moment. You people always have some excuse, don't you?" A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom, and for the first time, Alexis could see the cracks in Clark's facade. He had let his mask slip. The audience, too, could sense it, a racist undercurrent that had been buried beneath his professional exterior. The judge's expression hardened as he glared at the officer. "Judge Palmer, Officer Clark, I suggest you watch your tone. This is a courtroom and such behavior will not be tolerated." The tension in the courtroom had reached its peak. Alexis Green, a U.S. Secret Service agent, sat at the defendant's table, her posture composed and unyielding. Officer Ryan Clark, still smug in the witness stand, continued to distort the truth with every word he spoke. His claims of Alexis being defensive and uncooperative outside the Verdant Heights Hotel had been nothing but a gross misrepresentation of what had actually happened. But Alexis remained calm, even as the anger bubbled beneath the surface. Clark, in his usual arrogant manner, continued recounting the events. He had accused Alexis of trespassing, insisting she was loitering in front of the hotel and resisting his commands. He portrayed himself as a man simply doing his job, maintaining order, while demonizing Alexis as someone who refused to respect authority. His lies were sharp, deliberate, and cold. Officer Clark, when I asked her to identify herself, she hesitated, became defensive, and even questioned my authority. I had no choice but to arrest her. I had to take action. His tone was dismissive, and as he spoke, he cast a look over at Alexis, a subtle smirk on his lips. The room seemed to lean into his every word, as if the officer's testimony was the truth by default. But Alexis had had enough. She could feel the weight of his accusations bearing down on her, and the anger was slowly building up. This was no longer about the incident. It was about the deep-rooted prejudice that had led to her wrongful arrest. The prosecutor, Lisa Johnson, rose to her feet, challenging Clark's testimony with precise questions, but Alexis knew it was time for action. She was no longer going to let Clark's lies define her. With deliberate calm, she stood up, the motion cutting through the air like a quiet storm. Alexis moved to the center of the courtroom, her steps measured and strong. Her eyes locked with those of Officer Clark, who still wore that smug grin, oblivious to what was about to unfold. The room fell silent, the eyes of everyone present now on her. In one smooth motion, Alexis reached into her blazer pocket, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather of her wallet. She pulled it out and opened it slowly, allowing the courtroom to see what she held. The golden emblem gleamed under the harsh lights of the courtroom, her U.S. Secret Service badge. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The gasps of the spectators were audible, their collective breath catching in disbelief. Even the judge, Judge Palmer, a man who had seen his share of courtroom drama, was visibly taken aback by the revelation. Alexis held the badge high, letting it speak for itself. It was a symbol of authority, professionalism, and integrity, things that Officer Clark had clearly disregarded when he decided to arrest her. "Officer Clark, wait. What is that?" His voice faltered, his confidence immediately shattered. The smugness that had once defined him was now gone, replaced with disbelief and confusion. "Alexis Green, That, Officer Clark, is the United States Secret Service badge. I'm an agent with the service. I've dedicated my life to protecting this country, its citizens, and upholding the law. You've made an error, officer, and I intend to make sure it is addressed. Her voice was steady and calm, but beneath the surface, there was an undeniable strength. She didn't need to raise her voice or shout. The truth had already spoken for her. The realization that she was no ordinary citizen, a federal agent, hit Clark like a ton of bricks. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The courtroom was now alive with murmurs. Reporters scrambled to take notes, while spectators looked on in shock. The dynamic had shifted entirely. Officer Clark, who had once been the one holding the upper hand, was now the one under scrutiny. His earlier bravado had evaporated in the face of Alexis's calm, confident revelation. The judge, Judge Palmer, glanced at the badge and then back at Clark. He could see the officer was rattled, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. Judge Palmer, Officer Clark, are you aware that Miss Green is a federal agent? And if so, why did you proceed with this arrest? Clark swallowed hard, his face flushing. His earlier excuses seemed hollow now, and he struggled to find an answer. Officer Clark, I didn't know, I assumed, Alexis Green, you assumed. You judged me based on nothing but my appearance, officer. You saw me as a threat because of who I am, not because of what I did. And now you'll have to answer for that. Her words hit the room like a powerful wave. For the first time, Officer Clark looked completely powerless, his entire narrative falling apart before him. He opened his mouth again, but could muster nothing in his defense. The silence in the room was deafening as everyone watched his downfall. Prosecutor Johnson took advantage of the moment, her voice firm as she addressed the judge. Prosecutor Johnson, Your Honor, given this new revelation, I request an immediate dismissal of all charges against Miss Green. Furthermore, I ask that the court launch an investigation into Officer Clark's conduct, as his actions here today are not only unacceptable but illegal. The judge nodded slowly, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. Judge Palmer, motion granted. All charges against Miss Green are hereby dismissed. Furthermore, I am ordering an internal investigation into Officer Clark's actions. It was done. Alexis had proven her innocence, and Officer Clark had been exposed for his misconduct. Alexis snapped her badge shut, returning it to her pocket as she walked back to her seat. She had made her point, and she had done so with remarkable poise. As she sat back down, Alexis caught a glimpse of Clark's face. The color had drained from his skin, his expression frozen in shock. He knew the consequences of his actions were only just beginning. But as the room simmered with the aftermath of the revelation, Alexis felt a quiet satisfaction. She had fought for what was right, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been unjustly judged. Before she left the courtroom, she turned back to look at Officer Clark one last time. Alexis Green, the problem with people like you, officer, is that you think power is something you can wield without consequence. But that ends today. With those final words, Alexis walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned officer and a room full of witnesses who would never forget what had transpired. Justice had been served, and Alexis knew that this was just the beginning of something much larger. The courtroom was still thick with the reverberations of Alexis Green's revelation. As the silence lingered, a mixture of disbelief and anticipation hung in the air. Officer Ryan Clark had been caught off guard, his smug confidence shattered by the unassailable truth Alexis had revealed. The golden emblem of her U.S. Secret Service badge gleamed faintly in the back of everyone's minds, a reminder that power, when wielded responsibly, could dismantle arrogance and prejudice in an instant. Alexis, however, was not finished. She had revealed her identity, but she knew this trial wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about something far greater, justice for everyone who had ever been wronged by the unchecked abuse of power. And she wasn't about to sit back and let this moment pass without making sure Officer Clark's actions were scrutinized, his behavior condemned, and accountability demanded. She took a deep breath, her gaze still locked on Clark, who had not yet fully recovered from the shock of her revelation. His face was pale, his earlier cocky demeanor replaced with a nervous flicker in his eyes. He sat still, rigid, like a deer caught in the headlights, unsure of how to regain control of the situation. But Alexis knew exactly what she needed to do. She wasn't going to allow him to walk away from this with any semblance of dignity. Her voice, calm and authoritative, rang out across the courtroom. "Alexis Green, Officer Clark, I'm not done yet. It's not just about the false accusations you've made against me or the fact that you tried to intimidate me. It's about the behavior you've displayed, the racism, the abuse of power. Your actions are part of a pattern, and I will not let it slide." The words cut through the tension like a knife, and it felt as though time itself slowed. Alexis's voice, steady and unwavering, carried the weight of everything she had fought for in her career. This wasn't just about one officer and one wrongful arrest. It was about the systemic issues that had led to this point. Her words resonated with the people in the room, stirring something deep inside them. They were witnessing more than just a trial. They were witnessing a call for change. Clark, for the first time in the trial, seemed to shrink back. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing around the room as if looking for an escape. But there was no hiding now. The truth had been revealed, and it couldn't be ignored. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of panic. Alexis's voice grew stronger, her focus razor-sharp. "Alexis Green, you assumed I was guilty because of my skin color, Officer Clark. You didn't even give me the chance to explain myself. You saw a black woman in a wealthy neighborhood and decided I didn't belong there. You profiled me. You used your position to intimidate me and strip me of my dignity. That is not the behavior of a law enforcement officer. It's the behavior of a racist who thinks they are above the law." The words echoed through the courtroom, each one like a hammer striking the gavel. Alexis's words weren't just a condemnation of Clark's actions. They were a clear demand for justice, a challenge to the status quo. She had made it clear that she would not stand idly by while people like Clark continued to abuse their power. The spectators in the gallery were now fully invested in what was unfolding before them. The murmurs had stopped, replaced by a quiet intensity. Alexis had turned the tide, and there was no going back. The judge, Judge Palmer, sat up straighter in his chair, his expression unreadable but alert, as though he, too, was waiting for the next move. Alexis continued, her gaze never leaving Clark's now shifting figure. "Alexis Green, I demand that this court not only dismiss all charges against me, but that you also launch an immediate investigation into Officer Clark's conduct. His actions are not just an isolated incident. This is systemic abuse, and it needs to be addressed." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment everything was still. Alexis had made her demand. The courtroom was holding its collective breath, waiting to see if the judge would act on her request or let this moment slip away. There was a sense of urgency now, a growing realization that Alexis wasn't going to let this slip under the rug. This wasn't just about righting the wrongs of one officer. It was about sending a message. It was about showing that the system could be held accountable when it failed to protect those it was supposed to serve. Judge Palmer's gaze flickered between Alexis and Clark, his expression serious. He sat in silence for a moment, as though weighing the gravity of the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady, yet tinged with an undeniable authority. "Judge Palmer, I've heard enough. Officer Clark, your actions today have been both reckless and deeply troubling. I'm ordering an immediate dismissal of all charges against Miss Green. Furthermore, I will be ordering an internal investigation into your conduct, starting with your handling of this case." Alexis's heart pounded in her chest. She had been heard. The room seemed to exhale collectively as the judge's words resonated throughout the space. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. It was a victory, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been victimized by police brutality and racial profiling. "Judge Palmer, I will also be requesting a full review of your history on the force, Officer Clark. The court will not tolerate such behavior, and it is imperative that this matter is handled with the seriousness it deserves." The tension in the courtroom reached its peak as Alexis stood there, absorbing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. The prosecutor, Lisa Johnson, nodded approvingly at the judge's decision, her stance unwavering. The crowd in the gallery seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, their hope for justice renewed. Alexis, still standing, allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. She had not only cleared her name, but had also forced the court to acknowledge the systemic issues at play. It wasn't just about her. It was about creating a ripple effect that would force change. Officer Clark, on the other hand, looked completely defeated. The color drained from his face as the full weight of the judgment settled over him. The bravado that had once defined him had vanished, replaced by the unmistakable panic of someone who knew their career was hanging by a thread. His mouth moved as though to say something, but no words came out. He was a man exposed for his actions, and the consequences were inevitable. "Alexis Green, this is just the beginning, officer. The real work starts now. Your actions have consequences, and it's time to answer for them." With that, Alexis turned and walked back to her seat, her steps measured, her back straight. As she sat down, she didn't need to look around to know that the courtroom had witnessed something extraordinary. This was a turning point. For her, for Clark, and for anyone who had ever been subjected to the abuses of power that had brought her here. The trial wasn't over yet, but Alexis had made her mark. Justice had begun its course, and there was no stopping it now. The dust had barely settled from the shocking turn of events in the courtroom when the ripple effect began to spread, swiftly and undeniably. Alexis Green's revelation that she was a U.S. Secret Service agent, and the subsequent exposure of Officer Ryan Clark's racism and abuse of power, had set the wheels of justice into motion in a way that neither Clark nor the public could ignore. What had started as a single, tense courtroom moment quickly turned into a full-blown media storm. The headlines flooded the news outlets almost immediately. Secret Service agent reveals her identity in court, exposes corrupt officer, an officer under investigation for racial profiling and misconduct. The story went viral, not just in Dallas but across the entire nation. The news agencies covered the trial from every angle, focusing on the officer's behavior, the systemic issues surrounding racial profiling, and the boldness of Alexis Green's stand. The courtroom drama had captured the attention of millions, and now the public was demanding accountability. Television networks broadcasted the moment when Alexis revealed her badge to the stunned courtroom, replaying the footage over and over. Reporters on the ground interviewed bystanders, many of whom expressed admiration for Alexis's composure and her fight for justice. Her calm demeanor in the face of such clear injustice made her a symbol of strength, courage, and the relentless pursuit of fairness. Alexis, once just another law enforcement agent, was now being lauded as a hero. Meanwhile, Officer Clark was nowhere to be found in the media. The attention had swiftly turned from Alexis's triumphant moment to the man who had caused the entire ordeal. A flood of footage surfaced online, including videos of Clark interacting with other individuals in a similar manner. His condescending tone, his quick judgment, and his tendency to escalate situations unnecessarily. The viral videos added fuel to the fire, painting Clark as an officer who had abused his position for far too long. As the pressure mounted, the Dallas Police Department could no longer ignore the public outcry. Within 24 hours of the court's ruling, Clark was placed on immediate administrative leave. The department issued a statement acknowledging the severity of the situation and promising a full investigation into his actions. The media, however, was less than impressed with the department's response. Reporter: "How many other incidents like this have occurred? How long has Officer Clark been allowed to abuse his power? And why did it take the exposure of a federal agent to bring this to light?" The questions flooded social media platforms, gaining traction as thousands of citizens demanded transparency and accountability. Racial injustice had long been a topic of national conversation, and Alexis's courageous stand had given voice to many who had suffered in silence. What had begun as a routine courtroom session had sparked a nationwide dialogue about the abuse of power within law enforcement and the need for real reform. For Officer Clark, however, the consequences were just beginning. Behind closed doors, the department was scrambling to contain the fallout. Senior officers and department spokespeople issued statements expressing their dismay at Clark's actions. It became apparent that the police force had been aware of his history of questionable behavior, but had failed to take meaningful action in the past. The public was unforgiving, and Clark's reputation, once secure in the eyes of his colleagues, now lay in ruins. As the investigation into his conduct began, a wave of former victims started to come forward. Lawsuits from individuals who had been wrongly profiled or mistreated by Clark emerged one after another. Some recounted stories of excessive force, others of verbal abuse, and a few even described racial slurs that had been directed toward them during interactions with the officer. These new revelations only added to the growing backlash against Clark, further tarnishing his already broken reputation. One former victim: "I was just walking home from work when he stopped me. He didn't even ask for my ID at first, just accused me of looking suspicious. He put his hands on me without cause. I was terrified. It wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. He's always gotten away with it." The floodgates had opened, and there was no turning back. The lawsuits not only accused Clark of direct misconduct, but also pointed to a broader culture within the police department that had allowed such behavior to persist unchecked for far too long. The damage to his career was immeasurable. Inside the Dallas Police Department, things were rapidly unraveling. Clark's colleagues, who had once respected him, were now distancing themselves from him. Whispers in the precinct were growing louder, and there were reports that some officers were even refusing to work with him during his final days on the force. The trust that had once been present among his peers had evaporated, and now Clark was the one who was seen as a liability. His isolation grew with each passing day. In public, the backlash against Clark was even fiercer. Protesters gathered outside the police department, demanding answers. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for All" and "No More Racial Profiling" were raised high, calling for a reckoning that went beyond Clark's actions. It was clear that the situation was no longer just about one officer. It was a call for sweeping reform across law enforcement agencies nationwide. Protester, this isn't just about Clark. It's about a system that lets people like him operate unchecked. We want justice, we want change, and we want accountability. Even Clark's longtime supporters had begun to fall silent. Many of his fellow officers, once willing to overlook his transgressions, now realized that they, too, were complicit in allowing this to continue. As the investigation progressed, there were whispers that other officers might also face scrutiny for enabling the toxic culture within the department. Alexis, meanwhile, found herself at the center of this storm. Though she had been thrust into the limelight unwillingly, she carried herself with grace. She spoke out in interviews, using her newfound platform to call for broader reforms within law enforcement, stressing that accountability was essential for restoring public trust. Alexis Green. This is just one example of a much bigger problem. The issue isn't just about one officer, but about an entire system that allows for this kind of behavior. We need to address this at every level, and that starts with transparency, oversight, and a commitment to doing what's right. Though Alexis's words resonated with many, the fight was far from over. Officer Clark's downfall was just the first domino to fall. His case would serve as a turning point, a catalyst for the much-needed changes that would follow. As the investigations continued and the lawsuits piled up, the public's demands for justice only grew louder. Officer Clark's career was over, and with it, a grim spotlight had been shone on the pervasive issues within the police force that had allowed such officers to thrive unchecked. As Clark's downfall continued, one thing was clear: the fight for justice was only beginning. In the weeks following her court victory, Alexis Green found herself at the center of a nationwide movement. Her calm, unflinching demeanor during the trial, coupled with her unwavering commitment to justice, had earned her the admiration of people across the country. What had started as an attempt to clear her name had quickly transformed into something much bigger, a platform for her to advocate for those who had long been silenced by systemic racism and police abuse. Alexis, once a dedicated U.S. Secret Service agent, had now become a symbol, a beacon of hope for those who felt powerless against the injustices they faced every day. The media, social activists, and community leaders all began to rally behind her. Her face appeared on news outlets, in magazines, and on social media platforms. Her name became synonymous with accountability and justice in the fight against racial profiling, police brutality, and institutional corruption. At first, Alexis had been reluctant to embrace the spotlight. She was a quiet professional, content to do her work behind the scenes. But the magnitude of her victory in the courtroom, the way she had exposed Officer Clark's racism and the failures of the system, had opened her eyes to the power she now held. People were listening, and she realized that this was the moment she could use her voice to bring about real change. The first step Alexis took was to speak at rallies and forums where the issue of police reform was at the forefront of national conversations. She became a fixture at gatherings calling for an overhaul of law enforcement practices, speaking passionately about her experiences and the need for immediate reform. Alexis Green: I didn't become an agent to fight for just one person's freedom. I became an agent to fight for the freedoms of every person. The law should protect all of us, not judge us based on the color of our skin. What happened to me, what happened to so many of us, isn't just an isolated incident. It's a part of a much larger problem, and we need to fix it. Her words resonated deeply with audiences, and soon she was invited to join various panels discussing the future of policing in America. Civil rights organizations, activists, and politicians alike sought her counsel. Alexis's journey from a victim of racial profiling to a leading voice for reform had struck a chord with millions. She was no longer just a bystander in the fight for justice. She was at the helm of it. One of Alexis's main focuses became police training reform. She had seen firsthand the disastrous consequences of officers like Ryan Clark, whose unchecked biases and lack of proper training led to the abuse of power. She began working with law enforcement experts, policymakers, and community leaders to help reshape the way officers were trained to interact with the public, particularly in marginalized communities. The goal was clear: to eliminate racial bias and to train officers to understand and respect the diversity they served. Alexis helped create new training programs focused on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and anti-racism education. The programs also emphasized accountability, ensuring that officers understood the consequences of their actions and how to intervene when they witnessed wrongdoing from their peers. It was a slow process, but Alexis believed it was the first step in changing the culture of law enforcement. She also worked closely with policymakers to develop comprehensive reforms that addressed police misconduct and held officers accountable for their actions. One of the most significant pieces of legislation Alexis advocated for was a national database that would track police misconduct and officer-involved shootings. She fought tirelessly to ensure that the public had access to this information, creating greater transparency in law enforcement. Her work in consulting on policy changes became a cornerstone of her advocacy. Alexis understood that real, lasting change wouldn't come from a single court case or policy decision. It would require the collective effort of communities, governments, and law enforcement agencies. She spent countless hours meeting with leaders, organizing roundtables, and drafting policy proposals aimed at reforming not just how officers interacted with the public, but also how law enforcement agencies were held accountable for their actions. As her influence grew, Alexis was invited to work alongside civil rights organizations that were pushing for national police reform. She traveled the country, meeting with activists, speaking at rallies, and offering her expertise on police practices. She became a voice for those who felt they had been forgotten by the system, people who had been victims of police brutality, racial profiling, and discrimination. Community leader, Alexis Green is a warrior for the people. She stands for justice, fairness, and equality. She is a living testament to the power of one voice, one person, standing up against an entire system of injustice. Her role as a mentor to young officers also became a vital part of her advocacy. Alexis knew that the key to long-term change was to instill these values from the beginning of an officer's career. She worked with police academies to design mentorship programs that paired new recruits with experienced officers who were dedicated to ethical policing. The programs focused not just on the law, but on empathy, respect, and understanding the communities officers served. Alexis used her platform to ensure that the future of law enforcement would look vastly different from the past. But the fight was not without its challenges. Alexis faced constant pushback from those who felt threatened by the changes she was advocating for. Some law enforcement unions opposed her efforts, arguing that her reforms would make it harder for officers to do their jobs. Others accused her of being too harsh on the system, too focused on its flaws rather than on its strengths. Despite the resistance, Alexis refused to back down. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but she also knew that the fight for justice was a marathon, not a sprint. Every speech, every panel, every policy change brought the country one step closer to a more just and equitable system. One evening, after a particularly powerful speech at a rally, Alexis stood outside, watching the sunset over the city. She felt the weight of everything she had accomplished, but she also understood the enormity of the task that still lay ahead. The fight for justice was far from over, and Alexis knew that she would be there at the forefront, leading the charge for as long as it took. As the sound of applause faded into the distance, Alexis smiled to herself. She had fought for herself, for the truth, and for the future. And now she was leading a movement that would change the very foundation of law enforcement in this country. It was a fight she would never stop fighting, no matter how long it took.